There it is, folks. There it is. After an election fraught with partisan divides, bitterness, concerns about abortion, concerns about inflation, concerns about the economy, this map really tells it all. This is the state of the country right now. When you look at it, districts in red, districts in blue, and after a contentious sort of midterm campaign, here's where we stand. So it's been a wild 24 hours. Wanted to do a brief video with my thoughts in terms of, what happened with the midterm elections, my reactions, what it means for Congress, what it means for the law, what it means for the country moving forward, kind of where we go from here. First takeaway, I think clearly, is the anticipated, the expected, the historical red wave did not materialize. That's takeaway number one. This was not a blowout victory for Republicans. When you look at it, it wasn't a bad night for Republicans. I don't think you could say that. When you look at the races, how they're panning out, I think Republicans now have 211 confirmed House seats with more expected. When you look at their pickups, the Republicans will be the majority in the House of Representatives. And in the Senate, if current results hold, it looks like Arizona, looks like Mark Kelly will win, although again, long way to go, a lot of votes to count, not finalized at all. Looks like the Republicans may flip a seat in Nevada. So, as for the House of Representatives, there was definitely some turnover. When you look at the Senate, there may not be that much turnover. Basically the situation is, in terms of the House, I think the Republicans are going to hold a slim majority. If you look at the Senate, probably going to come down to the Georgia runoff to determine who controls the Senate again. Although I think regardless, you know the figures. You know the individuals who are going to control the Senate. And I know any Democrats out there are going to recoil in horror when I say these names. Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema. The swing votes once again. Moderate Democrats in terms of West Virginia, I mean, you see West Virginia there, basically all red. You look at Arizona, a kind of purple state. That's been a very close state for a couple elections now. That's who you're looking at in terms of the swing voters. So, I think the first takeaway is that the red wave never materialized. But I'd be hesitant to call it a bad night for Republicans just because they're likely to take the House, which will likely put a big dent into President Biden's agenda, but certainly not the wave of Republican victory that was maybe expected a couple of weeks ago or even in the days leading up to the election. Now I think to the more interesting points. I think this election was a big victory for democracy in the sense that you saw a lot of ticket splitting. I think there was an assumption in the past, and especially in this election cycle, that the individuals who were hyper-partisan, who would expected to just vote red or vote blue, that regardless of what happened, you were just going to be able to put them out there. The teams were going to vote for their respective players, and it's a game of turnout. And I think you hear that all the time, especially if you're a moderate voter, if you're an independent who's unregistered. It's kind of discouraging because you hear a lot about the fact that elections are really just voter turnout games. Whoever could get the most reds or whoever could get the most blues, that's the team that's going to win the election. And, independent voters, they're just sort of a myth. They don't really exist. They don't decide elections. And I think what you're seeing here is that there were a lot of moderate voters, and you saw this with Brian Kemp in Georgia, people who presumably voted for Kemp but voted for Warnock. You saw it in New Hampshire with Sununu winning comfortably, but Maggie Hassan winning comfortably as well. You saw this in Pennsylvania, to a lesser extent, with more individuals voting for Shapiro than they did Fetterman, and possibly splitting the ticket there. You saw it, you saw it in a bunch of places last night where voters decided that there were certain candidates that they didn't like on each side of the aisle, and that they were not afraid to go and vote for the opposing party. I will say, without giving away my political affiliation, I actually did that. I voted for a candidate or two who were outside of my chosen political party for the simple fact alone that I believed that they were better candidates and did not like the candidate that my own party put in. That was a big win for democracy, and I think that's a message to the political parties. And this is takeaway number 3. Candidate quality matters. I think that's something we learned in this midterm election. See, I think there was a lot of discussion, and you could argue whether or not Trump even fits this, former President Trump even fits this particular sort of case, because he did, did lose in 2020. I know there are some people that don't believe that. I do not count myself among them, so I apologize if you feel differently than I do. But the point is, I think when you look at such a high-profile celebrity like Donald Trump and sort of the cult of personality that he was able to build around himself and with his voter base, I don't believe that the same rules apply to the Donald Trumps of the world as they necessarily do some of these candidates in these local races who are lesser known, and who have engaged in sort of behaviors that the mainstream and moderate voters will not appreciate. And especially, it's one thing to be an election denier and a blood red Republican in the middle of the country, like you see here, where the districts are red, and you're surrounded with people who sort of feel the same way. And it's easy to be a staunch progressive in the coastal areas of the country and in New England where it's generally blue. What I don't think is a winning strategy is when you're in some of these states like Pennsylvania, like Virginia, like a North Carolina, a Georgia, Arizona, these toss-up sort of states where there are a ton of voters on both sides of the aisle and they're contested sort of places. I don't think that it is sufficient for you to go and be so staunch one way or another and expect to win. General Baldock in New Hampshire, with some of the election denialism and conspiracy theories he came up with. No offense, I'm not saying, I know there are people that believe them, not trying to be political in this. The point is, in a state like New Hampshire, you're not going to win as that type of Republican. If you're a Republican in the state of Maryland, you saw Larry Hogan showed you how to win elections as a red governor in a blue state. Election denialism is not going to be successful there. That I think is a lesson for both parties in the future. If you're going to try to turn some of these states a different color, you see it with Joe Manchin, and I know Democrats don't like him, but he runs in a way and he supports things that will allow him to be a blue senator in a state that is almost exclusively controlled by Republicans and voted for, former President Trump by 40 points last election. So I think the midterms reinforced that, because the question was, especially in the last few elections, well, is this going to be a sort of just voter turnout, whoever could get the most people on their side to win? I think you see in a few races where, and especially Georgia, Brian Kemp wins by 5 points more than Herschel Walker gets, and that's just an issue of candidate quality. That's an issue of voters being turned off by certain things, and I think that's a lesson that really, is something that should be paid attention to moving forward. Couple other big takeaways from the midterm elections that I found. The number of close races as well really goes to show you how divided the country is. And maybe that seems like a counterpoint to what I just said, but I don't really think it's the case. I think that the divided nature of the country was on display in just how many of these states are so incredibly close. Because you could have, and we've had in the past, Obama's first term, he wins in a landslide sort of election. Um, you look at even as far back as, a few years ago. It's the change in the country over the past decade, such to where there are so many of these races that are coming down to a few hundred votes, percentage point type votes. It really shows you the nature of, number one, the fact that it really is a divided populace. And even in terms of the independents, because you could go and say, well, if independents make up 10% of the electorate and you have even Republicans and Democrats on either side, could very easily be candidates winning by 10, 15 percentage point across the map. And the fact that you have in each of these races, so many close battles where states are won and lost by hundreds of votes, thousands of votes, it really shows you the divided nature of the country, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing. The beautiful thing, or what's supposed to be the beautiful thing about democracy, is the ability for people to disagree with you, but still, run a better race next time. The idea that my team may lose this election, and then we take some lessons from it, and we learn from it. And again, I don't know if the political parties are going to learn from this election or not. My hope would be that for the good of the country, both of them do. And if I'm a Democrat, I'm happy with the fact that I didn't lose in a landslide as expected, but I'm not taking a victory lap. I'm not taking a victory lap. If you look at New York, New York's a perfect example of a state where, one of the financiers for your efforts to reclaim the House gets, beaten in a state like New York. When you look at the map, you look at you look at Long Island going red. You look at a state like New York going red, albeit a lot of it in upstate. You look at some of the other areas in the country where there have been flips, in Arizona, in Florida, where the Democrats were completely routed. In some of those other states as well, that there have been some Republican pickups, and even in states such as Virginia, where you win two contested sort of House districts, but where the numbers in the suburbs have changed to the point where Republicans have made inroads in the suburbs compared to 2 years ago. I think there's a message for Democrats to show that inflation is a big issue, the economy is a big issue. Maybe the president and his team have not focused enough on it. Maybe there's a lesson for them in that. in that in the next 2 years, it's really going to be a message, even if they can't do anything about it due to the divided Congress and disagreements in terms of how the country should be governed. I think the Democrats are going to need to make a more salient sort of effort to try to address those particular issues. I think on the Republican side, again, it's the fact that, and this is really a lesson to both parties because there was actually a member of the January 6th committee that was lost her race in Virginia as well. My personal opinion is that the events of January 6th should not have happened. Okay? That's, the fact that it was the second time in history that the Capitol had been breached, that was bad. But at the same time, January 6th and the platitudes about saving democracy and the election deniers talking about voter fraud, those are not things that put food on my table. Those are not the things that feed a family. Those are not the things that are going to win elections, especially the close elections that you've had in this particular cycle and what's expected to be the same in 2024. I think a lot of people are looking for real solutions to real problems, especially moderates and, sort of in the center of all this, who are the, individuals that are deciding the elections. They're in it to see who's going to be the most competent person to take care of their situation. No offense, the 2020 election was over 2 years ago. January 6th was terrible. And this is a message to really both parties. If they were listening to me, which I know they're not because I'm not that important, my lesson for them would be enough with 2020. 2020 is over. I don't want to hear about voter fraud. I don't want to hear about the threat to democracy anymore. I want to hear about what you're going to do for me now. That's it. And I think you saw when it came to, I think there's some arguments that the democracy thing really won out. I personally think that the issues were economy, inflation, abortion rights, personal liberty, and crime. And I think when you look at it, and I forgot who it was that said this, but they were 100% correct. I think for the Republican side especially, it wasn't enough to just go and say, well, President Biden's economy is terrible. I think the key is, do you have some solutions to fix it? Do you have some solutions that appeal in a localized election, in a midterm election where people are paying more attention, where maybe you're getting more discerning voters than you might get in a general election that draws a lot more attention? How are you going to address those problems? And I think there were definitely some candidates out there who did not show that they could address those problems, who ended up being bad candidates, and they did not succeed during the midterms. So I think that's a lesson for both parties. Didn't mean to kind of rant there. But the 2020 election is over now. I have no interest personally in anything that really happened then. Like I said, what happened was terrible. I get why they're investigating it. I get that the DOJ has a job to do or whatever. But seriously, that was 2 years ago. I don't want to hear about voter fraud. I don't want to hear about the threats to democracy. I need some real solutions from real people. And that's how I cast my vote. I'm sure there's millions of people across this country that did the same thing. They cast their vote looking for someone with some real solutions. Now, in terms of what this election means for the future, I think it gives President Biden a big boost to any decision he makes to run in 2024. I know that there's been pressure on him from Democrats to go and say that, he should pass the baton to the next generation of Democrat. But I think his argument is going to be that, look, my party's moderation and my ability to work on both sides of the aisle and not be maybe a hyper partisan in the same way as like a Governor Newsom's going to be, as some of the other Democrats who are, looking to run for national office. I think that's going to help him, especially in a midterm like this, to say, my for as bad as my approval rating was, and maybe I didn't, you know, have a good enough message this election, we didn't get trounced. This wasn't a shellacking. This wasn't a whooping. We held our own. The Democrats held strong. Yes, of course, like any other party, we lost seats in the midterm, but ultimately, I'm still the right man for the job. I'm still a moderating force. I can beat the Republican extremists, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Ron DeSantis, whether it's whoever. And I think on the Republican side, I know a lot of people have gone and said that this was a bad election for Donald Trump. I think this was a horrible election for Donald Trump because when you look at the Republicans, and I think why, I think there are some Democrats who don't get the appeal of Mitch McConnell. Like, why do people like Mitch McConnell? He's horrible. Like, why are Republicans so? The guy is a consummate winner. You may not like his ethics. You may not like how he does business. You may not like him because you claim he's a liar or whatever the case may be. The simple fact is, in a divided sort of government, the Republicans have consistently found ways to win with less. When you look at the presidential elections, they've lost the popular vote, they've won the Electoral College. When you look at what he did during the Obama years, despite being in the minority a lot of times, stifling President Obama's agenda, keeping the country from going too progressive, denying Mitch Garland a Supreme Court justice seat. And when you look at the Republican Party, I think what happened with Trump and how he got so much power was that he won. He wasn't expected to win. He won. He delivered a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and they were able to go. They did their tax cut bill. The Republicans were able to put multiple conservative justices on the Supreme Court that are leading to victories for the Republican side to this day when it comes to abortion rights, when it comes to gun control, when it comes to potentially affirmative action. These are victories that the Republicans scored for decades thanks to President Trump and his ability to win the 2020 election and, keep the Senate under Republican control. Last night, though, a lot of Trump-backed candidates who were not the best were defeated in these close races. And when you look at what Ron DeSantis did in Florida and the resounding change where Florida doesn't even appear to be a swing state anymore, that was a statement victory by Ron DeSantis. That is the type of victory that changes hearts and minds around who could be the standard bearer for the Republican Party in 2024. And let me tell you something, Ron DeSantis made a legitimate case of why he should be the guy. And I think you're going to see a lot of Republicans that as much as they were on the Trump train, in politics, like in any other game, it's really all about winning. And especially on the Republican side of the aisle, who's desperate to retake control of the government after losing to President Biden, and especially with his approval ratings the way they are, they're going to be very aggressive in trying to avoid the mistakes of 2022. And I think this is going to be a big learning experience where you're going to see a big pushback against Donald Trump. Or former President Trump, I should say. Because again, the reason why the never Trumpers were kicked out of the Republican Party and aced away was because at the end of the day, Trump won, the never Trumpers lost, and it was a matter of, if you want to be a winner, you need to support Donald Trump. Well, I think Ron DeSantis has now given Republicans a legitimate second option, a legitimate alternative to those that don't like Donald Trump, but still want to keep the same sort of populist conservative agenda that Trump has liked. I think to a lot of Republicans, and again, I don't know if this is the case or not, but my thought is that DeSantis might be a more palatable version of Trump. less kookiness, less conspiracy theories, more results. Comes from a swing state in Florida. Well, former swing state in Florida. And I guess as a final sort of takeaway for this election, and I hate to end on a negative note because I think this election was very good in a number of ways just because of the nature of how it went, the closeness of the election, the amount of votes that were cast in the election, the enthusiasm, the turnout, the fact that there were so many split tickets. I think that's all healthy for democracy when people are looking at local elections, picking people that represent them, weeding out bad candidates, really holding people to account and forcing representatives to represent us. And, when an incumbent is defeated, especially an incumbent that's not doing what they're supposed to do and is not palatable to the people of their state anymore, that's really, a good thing. But one negative to end on, the time it takes to count these votes is utterly ridiculous. The fact that it takes states of, Arizona, Nevada, California in the West, the fact that they are still counting votes, the fact that an election has not been decided, and it is now 2 days after the election, and it might not be weeks before we even have all of the House races decided. Forget about the runoff for Georgia for a minute. That's different. Neither candidate did 50%. That's not what I'm talking about. The fact that they're still counting votes in those states is an abomination. And that's what undermines faith in the democracy. That's what undermines faith in voting. Because when you have results that are taking this long to count, and especially the national media isn't paying attention anymore, it gives room for people to suspect that there's fishiness going on. Especially in an election so important after the claims that were made by former President Trump in 2020. This was the year for the elections to be done right, and for the most part they were. But Maricopa County, the issues with the voting machine, unacceptable. The fact that there is still votes being tabulated days after the election, not acceptable. Because now it's very easy to go and wonder if things are being done correctly or not. I'm not saying that there's widespread voter fraud. I don't know if there is or not. I'm not in Arizona. I'm not in Nevada, so I can't say anything regarding that. But the point is, it should not be taking this long to tabulate these results. And the fact that these results are being put forward piecemeal, a few hundred votes at a time, is just very disconcerting. Very, very disconcerting. Because then you wonder, this is why people don't have faith in the elections. This is why people are afraid of the next election and wondering if the president's legitimate, and giving the ability of the hyper-partisans on either side of the aisle to say that the other president is illegitimate. So I hope in the future that's something that changes, because it really, there's really no excuse for the fact that it takes so long to tabulate these votes. It really isn't. Florida was able to tabulate them all. Pennsylvania tabulated most of them. Like all these other states have announced their results already days ago, and we're still waiting for a couple of states to finish. So, sad to end on a difficult note there, but those are my takeaways from the midterm election. Certainly let me know your thoughts. Certainly for every more of my videos, I'm going to be doing a lot more legal reaction videos, reviewing some interesting court cases, different things, giving my commentary, my opinion to anybody who really cares about it. But, just with the midterms, wanted to give my thoughts on what happened, what the situation was, what it meant, and definitely a crazy night. And now we settle in for 2 more years of political fighting of divided government, and hopefully in a little bit of a time there could be some compromise, there could be some agreement on certain issues, and this battle's over, and the never-ending war between the Reds and the Blues continues on. But hopefully everybody out there had a chance to go out and vote. Hopefully you're happy at least with the results and can feel content that your voice was heard. And certainly it'll be an interesting 2 years to see how it moves forward. As you look now, we're very much into the start of the 2024 political season. So midterms are over, but the race for president has already begun. So definitely tune in for updates on that.